Bienvenidos, soy Damián Kirchner, director de Mediamorfosis. La pandemia aceleró la digitalización de toda la humanidad. Público que antes no utilizaba plataformas digitales, hoy necesariamente las utiliza y eso cambió la manera de vincularnos con la tecnología, cambió los hábitos de consumo, cambió la manera en que el público consume tanto para la educación, para el entretenimiento, para el trabajo. Cómo cambió el mapa global con la pandemia es el eje de esta conferencia. Esta es la conferencia donde nos encontramos con personas que han pasado en diferentes momentos por Mediamorfosis, lo que llamamos nuestros Mediamorfosers, expertos en comunicación que vienen de diferentes lugares del mundo para ayudarnos a entender dónde está hoy el mapa de la comunicación luego de la pandemia. Para ello, invitamos a coordinar este panel desde Estados Unidos, desde Los Ángeles, a un guionista extraordinario como Adam Siegel. Va a estar también desde Estados Unidos el director de Campfire, el creador, uno de los creadores del proyecto Blair Witch, Mike Monello. Va a estar desde Gran Bretaña un extraordinario profesional del periódico The Guardian, Chris Moran. Va a estar con nosotros desde Europa del Este, Sara Bosanic del Instituto de Diseño Transmedia. Y juntos vamos a tratar de entender dónde quedamos, dónde estamos ahora, después de la pandemia, en esta nueva forma de contar historias hoy en el mundo. Bienvenidos.
Hello, thanks for joining us. We are on this panel going to be discussing sort of really how the impact of the global pandemic, what it had on expanded narratives and the kind of work that each of us do. To start, what I'll do is I'd like to introduce, we should all go around, introduce ourselves, kind of quickly explain what we do. I'll start. My name's Adam Siegel. I'm a writer and producer. I'm currently a consulting producer for films and television series in Ukraine that deal directly with issues around the war, around the refugee problems, number of social issues that are going on. And next, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Manello. I am I'm a filmmaker, producer, and I'm co-founder of a company called Campfire that works with mostly TV cable networks and streamers to expand their IP into non-traditional spaces, often for the purposes of marketing. So I've worked with everyone from HBO and Netflix to Amazon Studios and Hulu and FX and a whole bunch of other clients on their usually franchise IP.
Sarah?
Thanks, Adam. So my name is Sara Bojanic. I'm based in Slovenia, in a small country bordering with Croatia, Hungary, and Austria. I've been to Mediamorfosis many times, and I always think that Damian and me, when we met in London years and years ago, started to develop the same thing, but on the other continents. And that's why I'm really happy to be here and to speak and to share the experience of what was going on in our work due to the pandemic. And when traveling to Mediamorfosis, I usually presented the work that is done by the Institute, our own production. But today I would like to more focus on the education because that is the next strand of the Institute I lead. And I was really much engaged into the topic of speculative design. And speculative design deals with the future that is rooted in fiction, but it always have to imagine the technology because the technology is part of our everyday life. And this is why we are devising a project that is built together with children on the future city, and it's called Disco School. So what really, what I'm really looking forward is to exchanging these experiences, and to be reminded again that we need to dance. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. All right, Chris.
Hey there. Good to see you all. I'm Chris Moran. I'm the head of editorial innovation at The Guardian news organisation based in London, as well as New York and Sydney. So we're obviously a very big news organisation with a global reach. I'm one of the generalists here, I don't focus explicitly on XR, but my work covers a huge amount of what we do at The Guardian and the way in which we tell stories as well. So a lot of my time is spent working with our product and engineering teams to build interesting products and features and new ways to tell stories in the news. And also I focus a lot on audience. So understanding how people come to us, why they come to us, and what kind of experience they have, and how we can use that kind of data to respond to them and do better at communicating the things that are happening.
That's great. So let's kick off by talking about, so obviously there's been an event that's happened over the last year and a half or year and so, and it's really changed everyone's lives. It's changed the world in so many ways. So let's start with what were you sort of up to? What was life like, say, February of 2020, and in kind of the nature of the work that you're doing? We'll go into count. I'm going counterclockwise. So Mike.
Okay. Yeah. So in February 2020, our deck was pretty well stacked with a lot of live events. We were in LA producing an immersive event for Amazon Studios for their series Hunters with Al Pacino, where we took a 2-block area of Highland Park and turned it into New York City in the 70s, like circa 1977. So we had taxi cabs and 70s cars parked, had about 30 kind of immersive trained actors playing roles and wearing costumes in the 70s. We had all the businesses involved. So the music playing in all the stores was from 1977, and they had various specials. We converted the theater. There's a movie theater on the block, on one side of the block, that we converted into like a Times Square grindhouse, because the show kind of has that vibe about it. And so we converted it into like a grindhouse experience where people could go in and kind of see the premiere. And then on the other side was a bowling alley, which a kind of 70s bowling alley features in the series. And then we were throwing kind of a 70s party in the bowling alley. You know, and it was all kind of themed. It was all designed so that no matter where you were walking around, you kind of just stepped, you know, around the corner, you're in LA, Highland Park, and then all of a sudden you're in New York City in the 70s. And so it was pretty great, especially allowing people the freedom to interact with our characters that were up and down the block. It really, really worked out kind of well. And it was this big event. We had big crowds. And then as soon as it was over, on the flight back, everything shut down. The office was closed, and we had 2 major projects that we had already finished. We had done everything except actually put them on. Like we had constructed everything and designed everything for South by Southwest, which was canceled right like a week before, right? So we had basically done all the production work for 2 major experiences and then never got to actually present them to the public, which was really sad, because you know, you put all this work into this, and one of the most rewarding aspects of it is being able to present it to people and gauge their reactions, and hopefully they love it. So we most of our clients over the previous year had been really shifting from largely asking us to create digital experiences to more physical experiences, and they were shifting a lot of budgets to more physical experiences, with the idea being that quite frankly, I think most of them were kind of just pushing digital budgets into content for social. And because it's so ephemeral on social, it's kind of like just quick and fast, and they weren't really spending a lot there. But when they want to do something truly memorable, they were thinking more in terms of the live physical experience. And that, of course, just immediately shut down. And all of our clients started to pivot to ask us, you know, well, what should we do? Because even though they had their year budgets and they were thinking most of it was allocated for physical events, they realized that they needed to pivot, but they still wanted to achieve the same things that these physical events were doing for them. And that, of course, was, I think, the challenge we're all been facing, which is how do you take something that's really designed to help foster community and connection, and then try and play it virtually, like even here when we're all in our own individual squares, right? You know, and so the state of the world for me was very much an extreme pivot.
Yes, that's very clear. Sarah, what about you? Where were you at in February 2020?
I was in my home on the countryside near the border with Austria, following the news, but obviously I would say, yeah, caring, but not that much. And then I got a message from my friend in China, Chris Wong, and she started to speak with me about the pandemic. And I was just, I don't know, replying in my manner. And I got her message saying, don't be a careless European. I'm sending you all the equipment to protect yourself.
Wow.
And at that point, that made me think. And I did. I went into the action. I was the first one in the university. I teach design and practice at the university in Maribor, at the academy. And I was the first one to switch online, which was a heavy deal. I just started the year. I didn't know the students. They didn't know me. It's a small group. And they had to join the Google Hangout. So what happened? They were completely blank. So I had to teach them not just the subject, but a completely new behavior, and to devise a new methodology on how to teach design practice online. So there were positive and the negative stuff. And on the other hand, I would like to as well reflect on this really positive aspect that while we were developing this European project on the speculative design, we had several events planned on site on different topics, on how we will speak about future friends, develop rural and neo-rural aspects. So few of them were delivered, but then we were just shut down. We could prolong the project, but the method of education completely had to change. So what we did, of course, as a consortium, we were engaged with the Goldsmith University in London, with Napier University in Edinburgh, with Split University, with her institute, with Madeira Institute for the Technology. So we had to come together on how to do it in a different manner. So we devised few concepts on delivering this events online, and what happened, democratization of the knowledge. The subject is really extremely novel. There is a huge interest in it, and our event was sold out in less than 48 hours. 300 tickets gone. The Zoom was crowded. The dialogue that was happening on the chat was amazing. And all that we took out was beautiful because we had audience from all across the Europe, Australia, India, US, whatever you can imagine. And we even were able to develop an event together with the Mexico lab. And to be honest, to have an on-site, we couldn't do it because the Europe usually, it's tricky to support this kind of actions. So yeah, on the opposite side, I couldn't hug my colleagues, but on the other hand, the knowledge and the message we had went much, much further.
Oh, that's amazing. How about you, Chris? So
I'm going to talk about the Guardian as a whole, because I think that's more interesting than what I'm personally been doing, sadly. So I think, yeah, exactly. So it's been, I'm going to go back a bit further as well, right? I think it's important. So in February 2016, quite a lot back further, the Republican primaries start, right? And that's the beginning of one of the biggest news stories we've ever seen in Trump and his arrival and then his election. And in June 2016, whilst Trump is the biggest global story in the world, for the UK where we're based, on June 2016, 52% of the British population vote to leave the EU, kicking off the Brexit process and the single biggest story in the UK. And so for 4 years prior to this, our journalists and our staff have been engaged in the two biggest news stories I've ever seen happening concurrently. And they're not just single track news stories, right? These are completely global, affecting every part of our lives, from, you know, developing polarization, one of the biggest themes we've seen in the whole of society across that period. You're talking about economic impacts. You know, it's just been an extraordinary period of the news, and a sustained one. And I've worked at The Guardian for 20 years all told, and 10 of those years have been looking at audience. And our audience has massively increased from when we were a tiny UK-only newspaper to where we are now. But we'd never seen growth or interest at this scale across those two stories. So February 2020, everyone's tired, like really tired. Trump's, going to run for a while longer. We know that much, even after he's hopefully been voted out. Brexit is not going away. It's only got more and more complicated, more and more divisive. And then suddenly, a bigger story than either of those two things breaks.
Right.
And it's not a story that's going to last for a week. And I think that's the main point for me is at the moment this enormous disruption takes place, we are coming off the back of all of that extraordinary news. Everyone is tired and stretched. And we're going to have to cover this disruption in completely new ways and in new ways of working. And yeah, that's the kind of background for us was, oh my God, strap yourselves in because we're going again, basically.
It's going to be a bumpy flight.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting from my point of view. I'd been working in Ukraine for 2 years, been producing films and TV series. And we had just launched our third, what they call the pitch, or our second pitch UA, where we actually gathered all the different projects and they all present them, and we're going to whittle them down to which ones we select. And it was a kind of like halt, like, okay, everything stops. And the biggest problem I think everyone was dealing with was we don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know really what this is. We don't know how this is. I mean, what our jobs are, what the world will look like. Everything seemed to be collapsing around us. And I think the instinct, at least within our group, and one thing I noticed within different communities that deal with expanded narratives as well as traditional media, was to move to a kind of, let's take this time to bring the community together somehow. And so what we did is we actually started the beginnings of what we're now expanding into an education platform. And that was, so I started to, and my partner, who I worked, and the other American who I work with in Ukraine, we started doing these educational talks with TV showrunners and filmmakers and things like that to really just give an excuse for people to go on Zoom. People had just discovered Zoom, and we also streamed it on YouTube. And we started to give that kind of like, oh, here's this community, here's ideas about production and various issues that you're dealing with production and with TV and film creation. And it really succeeded in kind of bringing people together. So one thing I'm sort of gathering from all of you, maybe Mike not so much, but maybe you will, is sort of how the community that we're working in started to come together in its own way, and finding ways to sort of like, okay, this is happening. How do we find just almost at the beginning of a process of how to synthesize this or how to understand what we're going through. And back to you, Mike, I'm going to be curious, when you obviously had this big shift that was going on, these live events are not going to happen. What was the change in your process? Did you start to adjust kind of the projects and how you're going to do them, or what? What was that like?
Yes. Well, I think the skills that I ended up pulling on, and we all did at Campfire, were more the indie filmmaker side of us, right? Like you go all the way back to the early days when, even something like Blair Witch was a project that was about pushing against the constraints and working with the constraints to create something that uses those as an advantage. And so the first thing we did was kind of like start looking at what people actually were doing and what they needed. Because, the thing about the pandemic was that, typically our habits, we're humans, we're creatures of habits, and our habits tend to change very slowly. But what happened was there was about a 3-month period, I think, where everything was up in the air and nobody knew what anyone was going to do. We were all either working from home or trying to work from home or unable to work. And, the places we used to shop at, the way we used to consume media, all those things changed. You look at something as simple as podcasts and go, wow, podcasts used to be heard mostly during the commuter hours. And now they've completely changed to be all hours. And binging went up, because the commuting aspect went away entirely. And, and that's just one, format. So we really started to look at that. And then in the early stages of the pandemic with our clients, we started to talk about, okay, everything's up in the air. All we can do is look at what people need right now. They're home, they're trying to work, they've got their kids, they're homeschooling, which is not really allowing people to focus, and it's very distracting for the kids. So they need things to do with and for their kids. And just looking at how the changes, what people needed in the change, and then to try to find the intersection for the stories that we were being asked to help promote. And so early on, for example, we were contacted by a client that had a kids program called Ghostwriter on Apple TV Plus. That's a Sesame Workshop. And she's like, we've released a season and we're about to release a new one, and the show's doing great. It got a daytime Emmy, but we want to bring new people into it. How do we do that? And then, of course, there's a pandemic, and kids are often a big target for live events, because you do something for families and you get kids out. So we started to look at it and we went, well, look here, parents need something for their kids to do. And in fact, a lot of times, a lot of what happened was a lot of kids were just put in front of the TV after school hours, to just entertain themselves. And we thought, well, look, this show actually has merit. Why don't we take the characters and do something, create something that can actually help kids and parents during that time? And so we developed a kind of 4-episode extension for Apple TV Plus that took one of the characters, put her in her room, and having her deciding to write her own story instead of exploring the classic tales that the show did. And we created a parents and children activity guide. So it was like giving something for the parents and the kids to do. It gave the parents enough information about the series to both make them feel comfortable to let their kids watch it, but also have talking points to discuss with their kids over dinner or wherever afterwards, so that they could kind of continue the lessons, and the parents can feel involved, even though they're juggling all this work. And then we looked at distribution, because there's this glut of stuff and people have to discover it. And we started to look at the fact that local libraries were suddenly no longer able to hold localized events for their members. And we went, hey, you know what we can do? We can take all this material and we can package it up and we can partner. And we ended up partnering with 5 state library systems to deliver a program that allowed the librarians to do virtual events for their local communities around the content that we created, around the activity guide, and focused on, because each episode focused on also a classic book like Frankenstein or Jungle Book or Alice in Wonderland. So it was kind of like this win-win proposition of looking at libraries need something to do and they don't have the budgets to make it on their own. Apple TV has a budget to make something. Let's take all this change and push it in one direction that benefits everyone. And we put together a program. So it was completely unique. It encompassed looking at the characters and the stories, extending them, figuring out the needs of everyone involved, and kind of pushing it in the right direction. And so, it's. I always think when an event like this happens, the entrepreneurial spirit is what really carries you through it, and just being able to go, okay, all bets are off. What makes sense now? Yeah. And it's something that you have to do no matter what, particularly when you're in production on anything. You have to be ready to pivot at any time for whatever comes your way.
Yeah.
And I think that's an example of how we just kind of jumped on it and went, okay, everything's different. And then, as the summer came on and as things progressed, people's behavior started to become a little more codified, and we just continued to work entrepreneurially and just break the systems. The good thing about us is that we're part of the Mill, which is a Technicolor company, and everything at the Mill was changing because, when they do visual effects, high-end visual effects. And so, everybody's working from home, everything's in a state of chaos. And again, the entrepreneur looks at a state of chaos as opportunity.
Exactly. Right. You're looking at the upside, or where this crisis you can do something you couldn't do before. Right. I also like how you went back to sort of the thing. I think that a pandemic like this will always kind of make you aware of what it's like to live a life. I mean, you get to some real sort of truths in your own personal experience, but it also is the truths in the process, right? And one of the truths that I live by is, what does your audience need? Who is your audience? What do they need, and what do they want, and what is their experience? And I think you just went right back to that core tenet of our process, which is, okay, in this condition, what do they need? Sarah, what about you? What was that? How did your process, and what did you observe that changed in this time?
I'll reflect first to Mike, because he reminded me one of the biggest learning was that plan is not a plan. So we had to produce and reconceptualize things several times. And made a lot of the reflections. So one, to reflect on the market and actually the industry needs was a really interesting one. We are producing an augmented reality book that it's for children. It's on the topic of destigmatization, so it speaks about abuse really freely. We did an augmented reality element, and we went to the Frankfurt Book Fair to test the response and to test everything, to see how the market is responding, our audience, and as well, especially it was important for us to understand how publishers and distributors react to that. And one of the first learning was they are not willing to jump on the bandwagon of the cross-sectoral relationships. Why? Because one of my bigger ones, or even the medium or the smaller ones, were aware that this is the future, digitalization of the books in 2019. But one of the reasons why they didn't want to tackle it was because they didn't want to have a relationship with the programmers. They didn't want to sustain the technology. They didn't want to create a relationship and be dependent on them. So when we came back and reflect on that, that was okay, but that's easy for us, We self-publish, we self-distribute, we have different means, or we even get our book to the supermarket if needed, if the audience is there, etc. So I thought, okay, for us, we work cross-sectoral. We work with child behavior specialists, with psychiatrists, with children, with whoever, with educational sector, with IT sector, whatever. So for us, perfect. Boom, the pandemic. What happens with the education? From one day to another, we need to switch all the schools and all the programs online. So my country, Slovenia, was one of the lousiest. What they did, they took a book and they just copied the page. They wrote a sentence for the instruction and they put it online into the e-system. So how could children learn? They couldn't learn without the help of a parent. And some of the other countries proved to be really much successful. Like Lithuania was one that responded in a second. So the Ministry of Education called one of selected some of the school leaders, put pedagogues and entertainment companies, distributors at one place. So they had to come to a solution at once. So they were not only devising digital school, but they went to the radio, they went to the TV programs, etc. So the results they had and the engagement they had with children proved to be way more successful. So what I believe one of the takeout will be that we need to change the models, and that we will need to change the tools as well. And for that, we will really need to build cross-sectoral relationships. Because of really big corporations, we won't achieve a social change, a change in behavior, or even really experiencing and really exploiting what this situation and technology offers. Unmute yourself, Adam.
Chris, that was really, sorry, that's fascinating. Chris, how about you?
So for us, again, it's quite a different thing from, say, Mike, where much of the stuff is live experiences. So you're having to change a whole mode of operation. Fundamentally, we were going to continue putting out the news, and the technology underpinning that would work. That wasn't threatened in any fundamental way. So a lot of the shifts for us came around trying to come up with ways of working which could make sure that the quality of what we were putting out remained good, that we remained true to our values, and also that we were supporting staff at times in really challenging environments. So I think one of the things that I think everyone is saying is the extraordinary capacity of human beings to adapt and flex in incredibly challenging circumstances. It's really interesting. One of my jobs at The Guardian is to change habits, try and change culture for the better. And, Mike touched on this, and it's really interesting how hard it is to fight back against 200 years of habit in a news organization. And how embarrassing it is that all you really need is a pandemic to obliterate some of those, overnight. It just forces everyone to behave differently, and it's been really challenging. But I'm full of such admiration for everybody who works for us, because it's not been easy. I think one of the really interesting things as a topic that I've heard from friends of mine who work in the arts is about creativity, and whether you can continue to work really creatively and collaboratively across Zoom and so on and so forth. And I think people undoubtedly have found really good ways of hacking that, and some ways of working that are better. And whilst the news isn't a creative act purely, hopefully, it's definitely in that area. And I think one of the things that we really do miss is that propagation of our values, which in some ways it's not, you don't have to have a shared physical space to do that, but my God, it's easier if, part of the way you do it is by synthesizing everybody's expertise in things like a morning conference where all of our staff can come and talk about the big issues of the day. We can discuss what our lines are. We can hear our experts on it, and so on and so forth. And we still miss that. We haven't found a perfect way of replicating a kind of stand-up meeting where everyone can get the benefit of each other. And one of the reasons you come to work for The Guardian is because you get to work with amazing and clever people all day, every day, whether they're engineers or journalists and so on. So that's been difficult, but you can argue we're also quite well set up in some ways. Our foreign desk, our international desk, basically work remotely, just naturally. And so we have had models which we can look to try and make sure that we're able to work well. But it is tiring, there's no doubt about that. I think the other thing that's really come through is new ways of reporting, right? COVID, unlike Trump and Brexit, whilst both of those things have their complexities, COVID is an incredibly technical story. It's unbelievably technical. You need a hell of a scientific faculty to be able to, first of all, understand it, and then to be able to communicate it to other people. And so a huge number of our journalists and our general staff have had to get incredibly good at understanding what on earth is going on. And that's in the midst of quite a lot of misinformation and confusion as well. And that's also led us to think about how we communicate this outside. And what you've seen, I think, really interestingly, especially for this conversation, right the way across the global media, is an explosion in the use of data and also visualization to try and decode an incredibly complicated and fast-moving story for a really huge audience. And visual journalism has undoubtedly come to the fore for us throughout this whole period. That has its challenges too. I mean, one of the good things is most of those tools are based in the cloud, so most of those teams can work pretty well. But one of the areas of collaboration and creativity we have found difficult is when you're not just working within your own team, but you're actually, say, a visual editor integrating with a foreign editor to try and discuss what a story should look like. That gets harder remotely. There's no doubt about it. And you hack your way through it, but it can be pretty tricky. And also a lot of that is dictated by who is still in the office. We do still have a small amount of staff there, and whoever is physically there can dominate a conversation. It's not a malign thing, it's just a natural fallout from it. And it's something we've had to watch out for. Yeah, I think those are the biggest things I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting because on the parallel in terms of the Hollywood, where the experience I've had in Hollywood, also in the work I've been doing in Europe, it was an interesting time because suddenly everyone's at home. And what are they doing? They're watching TV. They're watching a lot of TV. So it was kind of like all the executives in Hollywood's heads were exploding because there was no better time to be a Hollywood studio because there's so much demand for content, but at the same time, it was impossible to make more content. So quickly, the stores of content were going to be empty and they're going to have to replenish them. And they didn't know how to do this. And so what I noticed, so there's two kind of parts of this. The first part is the development in the creation side of actually creating content. Obviously, writers' rooms, we all went on Zoom. The work I was doing, a lot of it was in Europe anyway, so I was doing it from LA and I would be on Zoom, but I would always have in-person parts of that. One of the challenges, and my colleagues had shared this too, is that Zoom on the one hand, you're really just not, it's exhausting. Like it's somehow like you're not able to sort of have the kind of moment of peace or being able to sort of just look across the table and sort of, yeah, remember that idea or that, whatever. It's all very formal. And I think that creates a kind of a heavier load in the creation process. And that's definitely something. So you have to kind of be thinking about, okay, we're going to do sections on Zoom and then, okay, everyone else go off your screen, at least together, and then be thinking about stuff or writing or doing stuff. So it's about, breaking things up. And I think that's something that we learned in that. From the production side, well, that's really a lot changed. One thing is the real innovation of for actors, the at-home audition video. Suddenly, you can't go to a casting director's office, so you're making videos at home. And every actor in Hollywood went out and bought ring lights and got like the best material and backgrounds, and they all became filmmakers, right? So they suddenly were making their auditions and doing them at a fairly high level. So it also, it made it more difficult because I think when actors are in charge of themselves, they don't know what the best take is, right? When you go to a producer's office, you get one or two, maybe two times, and then you're done. Here, you're the actor, you get to decide. So knowing firsthand among my actor friends, that was a little bit hard. And then obviously the other thing that happened was with production, particularly with Hollywood, and I noticed this also the work I've been doing in Ukraine, is you obviously have executives, you have a lot of people on a set who are there just to observe, they're just sort of watching things. What was discovered here was they don't really need to be there. And in this case, they can't be there. So now there were some innovations they had developed. There's some technology innovations on video taps where you can actually take the video tap signal, beam it through a certain application, and it actually can then show up on an executive's home computer. So they can actually be watching what's going on the set while not actually being there. And I was certainly watching what's going on the camera. That is a kind of a really powerful innovation because I think sometimes there are too many people on a set. There's too many people standing around, and that can kind of create a lot of distraction. So there was definitely that aspect of it as well. And I think finally the thing that I think is probably the thing that's really going to be questioning everyone was the exhibiting of theatrical films. That obviously stopped. The way the mechanism of Hollywood works is, these films, some of these films will pay for all the other things, right? Like one film will make $1 billion, but you need to have a theatrical release. So we've really, and so in some cases you've seen of some films being released in a way like the Wonder Woman film was released online. They sort of have found some sort of financial mechanisms to sort of, in a way, try to equate the viewership or the views to the types of earnings they would get if they were in a ticket or bought a ticket in a theater, but they're not the same. And we are still, even as we come out of the pandemic in the US, the numbers in theaters are still quite low, and that's a big question mark. So a lot of what I've seen here is this real question about what's going to happen in theatrical film, and that is something that's really a question that's still open. So let's,
I
wanted
to comment on something Chris brought up, which is about the challenge of getting teams to work remotely together.
Great.
Particularly when if your company, as our company, had a strong culture that was rooted in working together in physical space. And one thing I hadn't even really thought about that, but one thing we did do was pretty quickly pivot to working with a team of freelancers that we had long-term relationships with. And so all of a sudden, the how we worked together before became almost of primary importance, because what we lack is the ability to read each other's body language in this situation, because we're only seeing from here up. And so much is revealed in body language, particularly when you're thinking through a challenge creatively. And so being able to work with people that we had spent a lot of time with in the same space and knew well enough to be able to just boldly talk to each other and not worry about offending sensibilities or making someone upset because you took their idea and transformed it or something was really, really important. And I think central to our own success. I think we would have had a lot more troubles if we were trying to bring in new people and new partners into a process that was already kind of being made up as we went along.
Oh, that's interesting. And well, then let me segue that to sort of the final question for us today is sort of the future. How much of these changes and the things we've all talked about do you think are going to stay around? And how does that speak to the future of, building these kind of experiment narratives, moving forward? You can keep going, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, what's interesting is I think this fall we're going to see a return to physical experiences, and I think that the entertainment companies and the people who do them, and I think when I think fall, I think October. Like, it seems natural that the Halloween, the kind of haunted experiences and those things are going to come back. What I've noticed here in New York, where things are opening up and the restrictions kind of went from over a matter of like 3 weeks, went from like, okay, now you can be at 30%, 50%. Hey, it's a free for all. Take off your mask. Hallelujah. And I'm not sure I quite agree with all of that. But what I've seen, what I've observed at least, is that people are out in droves. They want to go out. They want to be together. I mean, you look at, in many ways, I think people's behaviors are, again, way ahead of corporations. You look at the stats, right? Like, leisure travel is back to pre-pandemic levels, but business travel is still less than 50% of what it was before. So it's like, from a work perspective, we're all kind of slowly, everything's changing again. But the people are radically kind of going back to some of the behaviors that they missed. So, the other night I went to a place that I'd gone to see many live shows, and it was a Wednesday night, and I went to see a comedy show. My wife and I thought it wouldn't be that packed because it was a Wednesday night. Lo and behold, there were 350 people there, and I was kind of flabbergasted. Now, I felt okay because they required proof of vaccination of everyone who bought a ticket and came in. But, the fact that many people on a weeknight were willing to go out for a comedy show, just to me communicates that people are craving that physical experience again. So I think we will go back to it. I think one of the things that we learned is, in an interesting way, I think we learned more about physical experiences, not being able to do them and attempting to try to replicate some of what they do oftentimes unsuccessfully in digital. You know, a lot of people pivoted to trying to build their own platforms to engage people digitally. And I think a lot of that turned out to feel gimmicky. Like, oh, I'll go see a play on Zoom. And at first it was like, oh, that's fun. And then after a while, it was like, I don't want to stare at my computer anymore. You know, and even like the Royal Shakespeare Company tried to do an experiment, but the interactions that they incorporated were kind of pointless and not really. It's not the kind of thing that would have flown if there were live experiences, you know. And so what we discovered is that there's ways that we as humans like to connect and like to see each other and be in crowds, be with people who are appreciating the same thing we are, and that's not easily replicated, and it's not going to be replicated by a platform. And so it's actually looking at live events in particular in the scope of what are you trying to do overall with everything, and what are live events particularly good at, and especially right now, what are people craving from them, and how can we deliver them safely as everything opens back up. And so I think that'll be the new standard for a little while. But I think, you know, all the predictions of people aren't going to get back together again and all that, I'm not convinced. I haven't seen, all I have right now is a little bit of data like air travel and the anecdotal evidence of people everywhere without masks here in New York and Brooklyn. I think we're going to go back to where it was pretty quickly.
We're a social people, right? So
yes.
And I thought of you actually because we did one of those experiences during the pandemic, which was the Stranger Things experience where you were in your car.
Drive-through, yeah.
The drive-through. So I wonder how much of those that might stay around. That was sort of fun. But again, it one of the things you're kind of nailing again is I think so well is, you know, we really when you're creating live experiences, but when you're creating any experience, you actually have to really understand what are the details, what are the specifics around that experience. So I always thought it was funny, people would have Zoom parties, for example, but a Zoom party doesn't make any sense because that's not a party. A party is lots of little conversations all happening at the same time. It's not us all standing in a circle like going, okay, now I'm going to talk at a party. That is not a party. That's torture. And we quickly discovered that. So I think it's about really understanding the nature of experiences. And if you're going to try to digitize that, then you really have to find the equivalent and not just kind of, well, we can see each other, it's the same. You know, you really have to dig deeper. Sarah, how about for you? How do you see the future, particularly around education and the work that you're doing?
So at this time, I disagree with Mike. I believe in a hybrid future. Why? Because we've learned new behavior. We had a complete decrease in traveling. We lowered down the money expenditure. I would say, you know, when you're driving your car and you cross the border, you see that your car is saying, you have crossed the border, you have crossed the border. And yes, you have crossed the border. You have entered my home. And my family is participating in majority of my events. My dog is snoring, or she's bored, or she needs to pee, or my partner needs to walk. So this border has been crossed and there's no way back. So if I reflect to the industry, many festivals like hot dogs, like Mediamorfosis now, are happening online. This enables us to put more knowledge together, more people. And I believe that more audience will be able to see it. So that's why in future, I believe in this hybrid approaches. Sometimes we'll use Zoom and consume the content online. And sometimes, yes, we're gonna be running with a huge hug to whatever event to meet our friends and the audience especially. So that's my thought on the future.
I think that makes a lot of sense. How about you, Chris?
So for us, just practically, I think we'll probably end up like a lot of companies in London, asking people to come back, say 2 to 3 days a week, right? In a mixed model, and it's going to be really tricky, I think, because doing that isn't going to give us back that feeling of complete collaborative opportunity, because, you know, sometimes people won't be in the office with you. You know, and the people I want to go up and wander wander up to and bounce an idea off informally won't be there. But it might bring back some sense of collegiate shared values and that kind of work environment. And I think one of the really interesting things about this pandemic is how different people's reactions are to it, right? You can find, understandably, a lot of, I don't know, 20 to 30-year-olds working for us who live in shared accommodation in London cannot wait to get back to the office. Just can't wait. And if I was them, I'd feel exactly the same. But you also have people in a slightly older age bracket who cannot see a future in which they can own a house in London, who would really like to carry on working for us and could move out of London and have a very decent life, you know? And, you know, you talk to parents and they'll have mixed things as well and so on and so forth. But it's not straightforward. I mean, you know, just at a very basic logistical level, you cannot have a meeting in which you have 5 people in a room and 5 people on Zoom. It can't happen. It can't work. It's a disaster. But, you know, yeah, there are opportunities. You know, you could look at remote working as a way of news organizations in particular, but arts organizations too, being able to decentralize their workforce away from metropolitan areas, right? Which certainly in England is a big issue, and to a certain extent in America is a pretty big issue too, with that, you know, sense that New York doesn't speak to middle America and neither does LA and so on and so forth, and that kind of polarization. So, I mean, there's so much to kind of think about. I mean, I feel optimistic because I think everyone's done so incredibly well so far. And we're finding ways, you know, people are finding ways of doing creative acts. I loved what Mike was saying about the way in which this period has forced us to think really carefully about what a live experience is by simply removing them and then trying to replicate them in grossly unreasonable forms. It's a really, really interesting thought experiment. And I think he's right. I think there's a huge amount that we've all learned about the things that we do from this. I think the one thing that I feel passionate about and good about is that period of time I was talking about from 2016 up to 2020 showed a huge collapse in trust in news organizations, right? Is the story of the time. And one of the very uplifting things about the period from the pandemic onwards is that we are seeing significant signs of that trust reestablishing itself. Thanks, hopefully, to not just us, but other news organizations who have actually taken up the challenge of trying to report on this incredibly complicated story really, really well and truthfully. So that's the big upside that I'm taking from it. And that's what I'm hoping will kind of root itself a bit more, that we're getting to a point in the 21st century beyond Brexit and Trump where people actually are starting to remember why the news is important. And why they probably, hopefully, touch wood, should pay for it.
I think all your points are fantastic and right on. And I would summarize it a little bit in what I thought the future brings. And what the future is really about is how we have all changed because of this pandemic. We've discovered something. I love what Sarah says is that we've crossed the border. But those who have families, and your family life and your business life was always very separate, and now it's a lot more combined. People have gone through tragedies. We have lost a lot of people in our lives, whether very close or just, you know, people you know through other people and whatnot. So going through an experience like this changes people. The one thing I was thinking about during this was, you know, Hollywood had been developing all of these TV shows and movies before the pandemic, and they're going to just keep making those movies. They're not going to change anything because they don't know how to, right? Like, it's very hard to do that. But will the audience still respond to them? Do they still make sense? And I think one of the questions I will have for people in all aspects of storytelling is, how are your stories now going to reflect what we've just been through, what we've all been through, all of these changes around our personal lives, the personal discovery that every person has gone through, whether they want to admit it or not, it changes you. And I think is going to really be telling the future in terms of the kinds of stories we're telling, about the understanding and the real awareness of each other and what it means to be alive. I think something that is definitely something I see on the horizon in content.
You know, Adam, there's an interesting point about that is if you look at I think we saw a definite shift in the type of content that was becoming popular. I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, Hollywood always chases what's popular, but I think if you look at the two biggest success stories in television during the pandemic were probably Schitt's Creek and Ted Lasso, two comedy series that are loaded with positivity, right? That at the end of the day make you feel good and about humanity and about the world and about our ability to overcome things. And I think that's a sign of.
And I would add to that Queen's Gambit. And I would add to that Queen's Gambit on the same reasoning, right? Where there is a kind of positivity toward it. Yes.
And I think, you know, and I think what we might end up seeing is a lot of material coming out about that, but maybe too late. And so people will be ready to pivot back to something else and always behind. So I think what's interesting is some of these, there's a lot of shows that seem to be going into production very quickly, and they're formats that they're trying to get done very quickly, as opposed to the kind of big epic shows that require VFX and you're going to make them for 2 to 3 years, you know, before you actually get to see them. They're going to sit in development. But yeah, I think I can tell from the briefs that we're getting, people are definitely tapping more into the act of positivity and experiences and content that make people feel good. And I think the days of that darker anti-hero stuff might be waning a bit.
I wish Nick was here to talk about gaming in this respect, because, you know, gaming's been the big beneficiary, I think, culturally of this, right? The huge numbers of people starting to game, and the biggest game of this period has been Animal Crossing on the Nintendo Switch, a game about a village full of animals you make friends with, right, and do nice things for, ideally. And I don't think that's an accident. I mean, it's gone completely stellar, and there are really, really good reasons for that.
It was great to see you. Thanks for joining us on this Mediamorfosis panel, and we hope we can all be together on stage live soon. And with that, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.